I'm Chris Jager, and I'm from Baker Book House, and tonight we are proud to present a panel of authors that are going to discuss the faithful crossover writer. So they will each introduce themselves as the time appropriate, but have a good time, and please send in all your questions for them.
Hi there, everyone. We are so excited to get started tonight. Each of us are going to briefly introduce ourselves. First, in our relationship with religion, since that's part of the scope of tonight's topic. And then we'll go back through around again and introduce ourselves in terms of the books that we've written. So my name is Rachel Mckennie. I'm an author and essayist and humorist and book reviewer from the Midwest. I often write about my faith in my less fictional work. So I've published pieces in the New York Times, US Catholic, and other outlets about my faith and living my faith. I'm a cradle Catholic, received every sacrament, married in the church, raising my children in the church, all of those types of things. And I'm excited to hear about the contexts of everyone else's work tonight. Erin, do you want to go next and introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name is Erin Bartles, and I'm also in the Midwest. I don't know if Kathleen is as well, but maybe we all are. We all are. Oh, well, that's so fantastic. So I grew up Lutheran, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and if I weren't married to a Baptist, I'd still be in that church. And but I did marry a Baptist who became a pastor. I knew ahead of time that this was going to happen. So I'm a pastor's wife. We have a PK, and he's doing all right so far. No crazy stuff. But I also work for a Christian publisher. So my whole life is kind of steeped in the sort of Protestant evangelical world of Christianity. And but I did grow up in a town that was mostly Catholic. So I feel like I'm a little bit of everything.
And how about you, Kathleen?
Like you, Rachel, I'm a cradle Catholic. I am centered in Missouri. And so I'm just a little bit south of Rachel and a little bit more south of Erin. And I say that my dad was one of 4. My mom was one of 10. My husband is one of 6. So we have 4 children, and people can't believe what a big family we have. And I was like, I think anything smaller than 4 would feel like a small family to me. So I have also done a lot of writing about my faith in a nonfiction realm through Catholic publications, and I write music for use in worship. So that's one of my interesting things.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's go around next and talk about our most recent fictional projects that we're talking about in the context tonight. I can go first again. My book, The Butterfly Effect, came out in December of 2020. It's a book also set in the Midwest. So I guess that's just a hidden theme tonight about a scientist who has to return home from her dissertation work when her brother suffers an aneurysm. It's a lot about family and caretaking and realizing that you need people more than you thought you did. So Erin, what was your most recent book?
My most recent book is All That We Carried, and it came out in January of this year, which is 2021, right? That's the year we're in right now?
Correct.
It is a story about 2 estranged sisters who haven't really spoken in 10 years after the death of their parents, and they are going on a hiking trip in the Porcupine Mountains, which are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it's a remote wilderness, you're not connected with anything, and they're truly not prepared for this trip. And but during the trip, they are going through the sort of physical challenges of getting through the wilderness, but mostly what they're doing is repairing their relationship and going through their own sort of spiritual journeys of, what do they believe about what happens after death, and do they think they're going to see their parents again, and a lot of these really big questions. So they're grappling with a lot, and it is probably my most spiritual, religious-y type book that I've written so far.
Fantastic. And how about you, Kathleen?
Sorry, my mute button. I wrote, my book is called A Song for the Road, and although she goes through the Midwest, it is a road trip novel about a church choir director from the East Coast who who discovers a year after she's lost her family in a tragic car accident that her teenage daughter had left her a road trip app. And so she decides, because she is completely self-destructed, she decides to take this road trip that her daughter and her son planned for her. And she has to like grapple on that road trip with the things that with the mistakes she made, the regrets she holds, the things she didn't know about her children, and learn what it really means to love her family in a whole new way.
Excellent. And so the scope of our panel tonight, we're going to start off thinking a little bit about how we approach writing and first, generally how we approach writing just as writers. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit closer and closer as we go through the questions about how religion impacts our writing or how our faith life might impact our writing. So we're going to start super general here. Where do you get your ideas? Where do those ideas come from? And Kathleen, I'm going to toss it to you first this time.
I always feel like such a cliche when I answer this question, because the idea for a song for the road came from a dream. But what I think is really interesting is that I'm a big Holy Spirit person, and I believe that the Spirit speaks in that moment between waking and sleep. And I'd had this incredibly vivid dream, and when I woke up, almost everything was gone except this single image of standing in a beautiful place at the end of a long journey, and knowing that I was looking at the place where I had lost my family. And so that was where the idea for this book came from. I find that what really speaks to me, it's anything that evokes an emotional reaction. So things in the news, like stories of people in the news, will really, I'll think, will that might make a story, and I'll scribble these things down. Dreams will do it. Other stories, sometimes you're like, oh, I really liked that, but I really wanted this to happen. And so, it's anything that evokes an emotional reaction is my inspiration.
How about you, Erin? Where do your ideas come from?
It's hard to say where they originate. They do tend to build on each other. So I may, like Kathleen, have something where you hear something in the news or whatever. So even today, I saw somebody had posted a thing about a city that was going to be having a planned power outage. And I immediately thought, oh, that's got all sorts of potential for things to happen during this. So I wrote it down. And it might be something that I don't do anything with for months or a year, but in that course of that time, in conversations with people and things that you read or you watch, or just kind of observing, I think I do a lot of silent observing, which, suffered a little bit the past couple of years, but I like observing people, and I like noticing the little things. And I think that those things just kind of attach themselves like static electricity to the core idea, and eventually it has enough mass that you can actually write something about it. So I would say they come from absolutely all over, although I would say also that I would never, I don't think, ever have one that came from a dream, because my dreams are horrible. They never make any sense, and they have no plot. So I'm kind of envious of that.
Yeah, I think the Holy Spirit is too busy with Kathleen's over there.
Clearly, I don't think he's involved in mine at all.
You make me feel better. I feel like less of a cliche now. So.
What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, for me, I totally subscribe more to Erin's point of view here. I think writers are such magpies. We collect things to build our nests. So for the butterfly effect, one of the little elements here is that my main character works in a butterfly house. And so, I went to the butterfly house a zillion times with my kids and thought, what would it be like to be a person who this was your job and you were able to work here all the time? And like any normal person, I spent 4 years researching that question, right? But it's when you sort of jam that together with other ideas that it really makes a book. And so the other half of my book sort of came from that idea of caretaking. And I lost my brother to cancer when I was really young. And so I always wondered what it would be like to be old enough to be able to be a caretaker alongside your family and to help take care of a sibling who is an adult. And so that was just, one of those pieces that you keep with you until it finds a place to sort of manifest itself. I think that's really true. So how much do you as a writer keep the audience in mind as you write? So how much are you writing for yourself? How much are you writing for an audience? And you can tie into that who you think your audience might be if it's relative to that question. And Erin, I'm going to toss it to you first.
Okay. It feels really selfish to say this, but I don't write for an audience. I write exclusively for me. I edit and revise for an audience. But when I'm actually writing, it's me working through questions I have, working through issues, working through things I regret, things that I wish, I had time to have many different lives so that I could do all these different jobs or whatever. So it's always first and foremost for me. And then in revision and editing, I think more about the person who's going to be reading it. But I don't think in particular about whether an audience is like a reader is going to be a person of faith or not. I just want to present whatever vision or idea or story I have in the best way possible. So whether or not somebody connects to that, depending on their background, is really out of my hands. So I don't try to make it fit one thing or the other, which I don't know that that's any plan for selling books, but that's what I do. That's how I enjoy it. I don't think I would enjoy writing if I was thinking too much about who was going to read it.
But that's very healthy, I would say, because I'm the opposite. I'm constantly thinking about whether this is going to be sellable, because I'm very aware, particularly with this book. Like, this is probably the most religious content that's ever been in any book. Like, this is my first published book, but it's not my first time at the rodeo. I find with this book in particular that I was really concerned. I really wanted to honor this character is a church musician like myself, and I wanted to reflect how beautiful that is in my what a great experience it has been in my life. But I was like, it would be very, very easy for this to get so heavy that it's unreadable for a non-Christian reader. And I actually really want this I want my writing to be an opportunity for evangel. It's like light evangelization. So like, I'm not going out there and trying to preach at people, but I want people to see, hey, ordinary people might use some words they shouldn't, and they might have done some things in their past that they actually are really grappling with. The fallout from that in ways that we don't normally see, and to recognize the authenticity of that. So I'm very, very conscious at all times of that balance between secular and Christian. It's a very, very hard line, and it was very scary to walk. But I felt really lucky to have a critique group that is almost entirely populated by people who really aren't religious. So they were very good about telling me when I was getting too heavy on the religion and the music.
I will say I had similar readers in terms of insects for mine, because it was like, what is too many bug facts? But I'm
not sure you could have too many interesting bug facts.
Oh yeah, well, I appreciate that.
For me.
Yeah. It's definitely a joy for me to look at. For me, I haven't really written any religious characters into my books, at least not any of them that have been published. So I have some in draft forms. And I think one of the things I'm continually grappling with is how to make someone of faith a true character and not a caricature. Because to me, when I'm reflecting my faith in essays or nonfiction format, I feel very comfortable being true to myself and explaining what my point of view is and feeling like I'm coming from a solid place of my own experience. But to develop some other character's full entire faith life seems so much harder than discovering and developing someone's whole entire PhD program. So it's easier to fake some of those elements. Whereas I know that if I have a Christian audience reading a Christian character, I want that character to feel authentic, but I also know everyone's lived faith journeys are so different. So it's so complicated. But I'm like you, Erin, in that I don't have an audience in mind as I'm drafting, but as I'm revising, I have to, because truly, I think you get stuck in your own head. And I'm sure, chime in the chat if you're also a writer and you're reading this. I'm not sure whether you experience feeling like you're writing for an audience or not, but it can be really hard to finish a project if you're thinking too much about the audience, at least in the first draft.
I would say that's one of the reasons I don't think about it, just because see, I publish with a Christian publisher, but my books are not typically heavy on religious themes. I think as real to life as I can make them without having people swear, because I'm not allowed to do that. But I really don't want to, I don't want to think about how somebody's going to react, because you never know where your reader is coming from. And if you have a crossover fiction, you're going to have readers from a wide spectrum of levels of belief or things that they believe in. And to try to please people, I think, is dangerous in your writing, because then when you're trying to please people, you're not writing the truth. And anytime that you write the truth, you're going to, and about anything, I'm not just talking about spiritual matters, anytime you write truth about being a human being, you have the opportunity to really get under someone's skin. And I think that's what writing is for. I don't think it's for just throwing back whatever somebody wants to hear. It's putting a mirror up in front of us and showing us everything, the ugly stuff as well as the stuff that we can be proud of. And I think that when I think of readers too much, I start thinking of like, well, you know, somebody won't like this because of this reason. And I think that just hobbles your writing.
It can hobble. That's one thing that I dealt with in writing A Song for the Road, was raising questions that could be, that are not questions we would normally, I have there's one of the things that my character hears along the way is that maybe one of her children was gay. And this is not a subject that we discuss much. I feel like I'm jumping ahead, Rachel, but this is not something that we discuss. It's kind of a closed topic in Christian circles. But like, I wanted to raise the question, what would happen? Like, how would I react as a mother if I were to be confronted with that? And I think that raising those questions are important. Raising the questions is important, but I'm also very aware, because I write music, and I write music in a very, very narrow niche for congregational singing. It has lots and lots of rules. So audience is never something that I can really get away from. I'm just trained into paying attention to that, because like, actually there's this, I heard it, I'm not totally sure that this is accurate, but I believe that it was Igor Stravinsky who said, the greater the limitation, the greater the art. And I heard that in college at one time, and I thought it was so true. Like, if you have to be in these incredibly narrow strictures and you can still make something beautiful and unique out of it, then that's real artistry. And so that's what I tell myself that a lot, as I'm like, well, this is what I want to say, and how do I say it?
Brenda put a great question in the chat. She said, lately, the advice she's been getting is to define your audience, which is really important for nonfiction, but not so much for fiction. And that's her question. And what I would say is more to know your genre. And so to know what is normal within the types of books that you're trying to market your book alongside. So what kinds of things are the people who you wish you were placed next to on the shelf doing? What kinds of conventions are they pushing back against? Of course, you don't have to keep the same conversation that they're having, but there are certain things that are typical. For instance, if you're writing romance, you need to end with a happily ever after. That's part of the genre. So knowing sort of the conventions of what you're writing within, you know, if you're writing women's fiction, it's about a journey. It's an emotional journey. The character needs to change from beginning to end. So I'd say that in understanding an audience, it's more about understanding their expectations, because there's no way that you could go out and talk to every single person who reads your book and know exactly what their background is or what experience they have with a sensitive topic that you're bringing up.
And I think that piggybacking on that, it's knowing their expectations and deciding which ones you will fulfill and which ones you would like to turn on their heads. Because I am more and more, the books that I like, the movies that I like are ones where you can feel the normal thing coming and then it doesn't come. Something else happens. And that is so much more interesting to me than watching the same old thing. Now, I know that some people find a lot of comfort in the same old thing. And I think that that's why romance has these tropes, because you can't end it with them not getting together or people will be very angry with you. But I love it when my expectations are not met in a good way.
I completely agree. Well, and I think piggybacking off of that question, as well as something that Kathleen touched on, this whole idea of raising questions, right? We raise questions a lot as writers, especially as writers who write within the women's fiction genre, right? A lot of what we do touches on contemporary issues. So how much in our role, either as authors or authors of faith, do we ask questions, and how much do we answer those questions? What do you see your role there?
I can go first if you want. I definitely am someone who likes to ask questions, and I like to leave the reader to answer them. As a reader, that's what I like to experience. I don't like everything being spoon-fed to me. I don't like everything tied up in a little bow, and I don't like endings that are too neat, because I feel like that's not like real life. And in my writing, I want to be as real as I can about life. Like, that's what I'm interested in exploring in these books. So I really like raising questions, and in All That We Carried, I raised a lot of questions about, what happens after you die, the eternal significance of people, what makes you worth something, all these big questions that I think throughout your life, you'll kind of have these questions here and there, but I don't intend in that book to give my answer. I know what I believe about those things, but I'm not going to say that as my answer. I don't think that fiction is the place to tell people what to think. I think that nonfiction is the place where you give people the answers and the solutions, and fiction is the way that we explore our own experiences, our own inner thoughts about things, our interactions with other people. And that's, to me, is the fun part.
I would agree with that. I think that the beauty of fiction and what makes me so, I did not recognize this for a long time, but once I had it put into words by someone else, it resonated so deeply that story allows us to get inside someone else's experience. And that's what we're lacking right now. Like, if you look around the world, we have division, and you say one thing and you get attacked for it. And like, the things that we're experiencing are resistance to empathizing with others. And story gives us a way, like, if I go out and say, well, here is how the world works, boom, 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 then everybody goes, and they can't deal with it. They feel threatened. I know this. And I think story gives us a way to get into that, because you actually get to step inside someone else's experience and say, oh, that's what that would, oh, this makes sense to me. I never thought about that before. And for me, this is particularly profound because I grew up with a very, here's how the world works. I have all the answers. Boom, 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 boom. And then my second child of 4 has Down syndrome. And we did not have any idea until she was born. And I was like, one of my religious talks that I give is about how I came face to face with this idea that I'd grown up deeply pro-life in the pro-life movement. And I realized that there was this huge not openness to life within me when I faced that reality. And so to look in the mirror, it just caused me, it just upended everything. And I started to realize that a whole lot of the things that I thought were really black and white were not as, were a lot more gray than I thought. I just never experienced anything other than like the way things worked in my world. But suddenly having to look at it from the perspective of disability, just like it just turned everything upside down. And so having been through that process, that incredibly painful process of having to rethink everything that I think is true about the world, that made me really sensitive to the fact that it's hard to make those changes. And even some people around me who've experienced like tangentially some of this stuff about disability still don't get it, because it hasn't resonated that deeply with them. And so to me, story is the best. Like, I can witness, I write lots of essays, lots of blog posts about disability, but I think that story allows us to get inside the experience in a way that we can't do by personal witness, because we get defensive.
I think that's all extremely eloquently put. I definitely would say my own fiction definitely doesn't answer a lot of questions, although I sort of struggled with that question when it comes to the particular book that I wrote. The Butterfly Effect has a very unlikable narrator. And so you're hearing the perspective of this book told from someone who is grumpy all the time and who doesn't really like people. And so one of the questions you have to answer in the book is, how do you come to terms with, allowing people to come in? And I did want there to be somewhat of an answer for that, or an ability to forgive, or an ability for mercy, or an ability to allow wounds to heal, not in an unrealistic way, but over the course of a book. So definitely not neat bows or packages that are tied up. But I think that's probably the ways in which my faith impacts my writing, is sort of that empathy, or the forgiveness angles definitely touch. I don't think I can not have them touch my work or the things that impact me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that what I think happens when we all write women's fiction, essentially, where we're talking about an emotional journey. I mean, you have to have somebody change from X to Y or this far. And I think that when you get into, if we're thinking about readers and what they expect from a book, I've definitely had people in reviews or in talking to me in book clubs wish that I had done this with the ending of All That We Carried. Well, why didn't you make her do this? And why didn't she get this far? And I've had to explain to people, this story takes place over a week. How much does somebody change in a week? So you can't get them from where they are at the beginning to where you think they should be in their life. If you're talking about faith and what they believe, that's not necessarily going to happen overnight. I know that for some people it does, but not for everyone. And so I think that you have to come up with this realistic, how much of an answer can I give, right, for this particular problem? And if you're talking about somebody who's coming to grips with, all the things that they believed are being upended, or all of the, they're not going to have it all figured out necessarily by the end of the book, but they will have grown some. And I think that's, that's all we can expect of ourselves. We can't be perfect.
I think that's fantastic. And I think that really naturally leads into questions that we set for ourselves about boundaries. And part of this would be, Jennifer asked a great question about social media use and sort of boundaries you set for yourself as a person who's an author on social media. Are there things you don't touch? But then also we'd like to lead into a general description of, like, what about in your fiction? Are there things that you don't touch, or that are boundaries that you wouldn't go towards? I can even go first with this one, because I honestly have very few boundaries. I'm a Catholic who swears. I am a humorist, so a lot of the things that I do are for silly impact. I think I'm very much of a Jesuit Christian, a Jesuit Catholic. So if you know what that is, I'm more of like social justice and helping the poor, and I'm a little less don't do this, you're going to hell. Like, that's just not my framing. So I'd say that I have a more gentle, joking demeanor, and sometimes it's a little bit silly, but I don't make anti-Christian jokes, for instance. That's outside of my realm, on social media especially. And we'll talk about fiction separately, but in your social media presence or in how you present yourself, Erin, do you have any of those considerations?
Well, I think that I've never actually thought of this question. I'm pretty much myself, which means that, yeah, occasionally I'm going to swear, because that's just, I don't believe that, that Christianity is about swearing and smoking and, things like that. It's about believing in the person of Christ and what he did and how that reconciles me to God. I don't think it's about all these other little things that we've tagged onto it over the years. And a lot of that comes from popular culture. It comes from the Victorian era or June Cleaver, or, these different things that are piled on. So I'm just myself. I am always aware that I'm a pastor's wife. And so there's certain things that I'm just like, well, I don't want this to reflect that on him. So, and I'm also aware that, I don't want to be someone who puts stumbling blocks in front of people when it comes to faith. but I'm also not a legalist, and I don't believe that I need to pretend to be better than I am. I think that that's really counterproductive for people of faith to do that. And I think it builds walls where if you're not somebody of faith, you see that and think, oh, well, I have to become a completely different person, or I have to do this before I can be a Christian. When in reality, it's the opposite, that we're enabled to change through faith. And I don't want to also set up this idea that I've got it all together or I'm perfect, because that is surely not the case. And I don't think that's helpful for people. I think that it's much more approachable if you're just honest about your failings. And that means that there have been times when I've needed to apologize on social media to people. And it also means that, you know, the people in my life who are a lot more conservative than I am aren't happy with me. And the people in my life who are a lot more liberal than I am aren't happy with me. And I just exist in this, you know, nebulous middle space where nobody's happy with me, but I'm okay with myself.
That sounds so familiar, Erin, because I feel like that like you're never going to make everybody happy. And the temptation is to like close in and box up. But I am a member of a large, incredibly loud and opinionated German Catholic family. And everyone in the world is entitled and has a need to hear our opinions on everything. So like, and my husband is a PR guy. So he is always like, yeah, don't engage. Doesn't matter. Not going to change anybody's mind. And I'm like, but I have to say something. So I have this like, you know, the angel and the angel on my shoulders telling the opposite things. It's not an angel and a devil, because they're both right at different times. As far as social media, I don't think you're ever going to get that right. The thing is that you just have to be thoughtful and intentional. And every time that I post in haste, I have regretted it. So like when I blog, like my husband and I use natural family planning. Okay. Like this is not something that is really even all that common in the Catholic Church. Let's be honest.
We do too.
As I know, I was so excited when I saw that. I was like, hey, I know another author. So it's something that I think is really, really great. And I used to get much more in people's faces about it, and then started to realize that you're not going to get anybody. You're not going to win anybody over by telling them why they should, you know, do this instead of that. And I don't know. I just think there are that one time I wrote a blog post that was very opinionated because I wanted to take advantage of the news cycle. And my sister said, you are wrong about one bomb. And I went, oh man, she's right. I was totally wrong. I was just wrong. So like, that was my reminder that I got to be slow and just accept the fact that I'm not going to be able to jump on the news cycle and like ride the trends, because it's not who I am. I need to stop and think authentically and think carefully. And I honestly, I think that does better work for Christianity to approach it in that way. We have a tendency to knee-jerk react to things. And
Kathleen's social media is patient, and so Kathleen's social media is kind, and it's slow to anger. And
sorry, the thing keeps going away. Do not overstate me. Anger is huge. Anger is always right here, waiting to just leap out. I get very angry. I just try really hard to be calm and reasoned about things. And I insist that everybody has to use reason and good sources when they're talking on my Facebook.
Well, now let's talk about real fiction, not fake fiction, like facts that promise to be fiction on social media. So what about our fiction? Is there lines that you draw in the sand for your writing? How does that work for you? And Erin, I know it's a little bit different, especially since you work with a Christian publisher. Some of those lines are drawn for you. So you can talk a little bit about that.
They sure are. So I think that were I to have my druthers, there would be a little light swearing every once in a while because that's how people talk. I'm not somebody in general who likes reading about or watching certain things on screen. Basically, I think that in matters of romance and sexuality and things like that, the buildup is the interesting part. I don't need to see what happens after because I know what happens after. I'm an adult, been married a long time, I know all about that. I don't think that that's the interesting part of the story. So I don't see, even if I were not publishing with a Christian publisher, I don't see myself being explicit about scenes like that. But I will say there's a funny little thing that recently happened. So the book that I have coming out in January just went through edits this summer, and I happened to be in a work thing sitting next to the president of our company, because I actually work for the same publisher that I publish with. Forgot to add that little detail. This makes sense only if you have that detail. And somehow at the table we were at, we got into talking about swearing, and the president of our company is a very laid back guy. I know that he swears. and I said, in this manuscript, I had to remove a German swear word, which I didn't think that most people would know what it was anyway. And I also was told that I needed to remove somebody flipping somebody off. And I said, would you have had a problem with that? I mean, it's not like, you could say so-and-so cursed. You wouldn't say the actual word, but you could say that they cursed. And to me, that's just a visual curse, right? And he's like, oh, I wouldn't have had a problem with that. It's just like, oh, I could have left it in if I'd known. So I emailed my editor and I was like, just so you know, next time, this is okay. But I did have, in my first book, I had 3 timelines, and one of them was in the 1960s, and I had 2 main characters smoking because everyone smoked in the 60s. And I was advised, not that I had to take it out, but I was advised that I would probably get flack from people reviewing it on Goodreads, from very conservative evangelical Christian readers. And I really didn't care about that because I think that's silly. But I took it out because I realized it was not plot related. In the same book, I had an adulterous relationship that couldn't be taken out, plot related. And they were fine with that, but not the smoking. So yeah, the limits that I have are pretty much imposed from my publisher at this point.
How about you, Kathleen?
There are lines I won't cross because there are, like, my worldview. My belief is that that whitewashing the world does no one any good. Pretending that it's not there just puts us all in a bubble, and we're in enough of a bubble as it is. We need to get outside of it. But that being said, I loathe the F word. I can't stand it. So you will never see it in my writing ever. I can say that with great certainty. I don't do a lot of, I'm pretty light with language, and I only use it insofar as I don't particularly curse myself much, little bit. Thanks, Lindsay. But other people I know will. And so you have to, like, you run the risk of looking like you're clueless and in a bubble. The other thing is that I will acknowledge and I will recognize that things happen outside of marriage that shouldn't, but you're never going to see me, you're going to see that happen or be referred to in my work because I recognize that it happens, and that's part of what we get wrong about love. But you're not going to see me suggest that it was a good thing or that it was not. You're going to see me say, and this is what the fallout was. So that's my Christian background coming out always.
For me, the things that are red lines for me are more violence-based. Romantic elements don't bother me so much. I read a lot of different types of books, but for me, it's more of the more violent elements or the hate-based elements that would really be red lines for me. Those are things that I just couldn't see myself writing. I think it would hurt my soul to write those types of elements. So I probably would never write, a more violent book than what I write. I just couldn't. I'm such a little soft puppy dog.
You're only like, I've only given you the limits that I've ever thought of. That has never occurred. I feel fairly confident that I can't do that either.
See, and for me, I think it would depend on the context, because I fully intend to write a book related to a war at some point, and there's going to be a lot of violence in that sort of a story, and so probably I'll have to do that. But I don't think that bothers me quite as much as I agree with Kathleen that like any sort of thing that I wouldn't do myself and I don't think is helpful for people to do or healthy, or I feel is sinful, is not going to be something that's ignored, but it's not going to be something that's celebrated.
Let's see here. Let's talk a little bit about the marketing side of things. So how did you find your team or your publication outlet? This is a little bit more general writing stuff. I know we have a lot of authors here on the panel. So thinking about what was your path to publication? And Kathleen, do you want to go first? I know you talked about multiple novels that you wrote before A Song for the Road.
Yeah. I have always written, I've always written women's fiction, even though it's like my very first attempts at writing stories were about princesses in worlds that don't really exist. The reality was that it was still women's fiction. I just didn't know what I was doing until WFWA came into existence and rocked my world. But it's taken, basically, I have never considered going the Christian route because I recognized that I was not talking enough about matters of faith. And I felt like I wanted to reach an audience that didn't necessarily believe in Christianity or perhaps even in God. I wanted to be able to reach those people and bridge. So to me, it's always been a traditional publishing was always the way that I wanted to go. And I just queried the heck out of it. I queried 4 novels and probably 12 different sets of rounds of querying with a different query every time. So, and Alcove, with this book, like I had tremendous anxiety because it really is in the crack more than anything that I'd written before, and possibly anything I will write after. We'll have to see. It really is in that crack because this is a woman who's having a crisis of an existential crisis, and it's a religious woman who's having an existential crisis. So it's going to have a faith component to it. And she's driving across the country wrestling with her identity as a woman and also with her identity as a church musician. How do you, like when you're having an existential crisis, it's a crisis of faith. So I had tremendous anxiety about where this was going to land. Was I going to get told to take it out, ease up, go Christian? And I knew it wasn't Christian either because there were topics that, like, she has a memory of seeing something she didn't want to see, and it's pretty important. Like, it's not something you can just take out. And she has like a memory of her own experience doing of her own experience, being involved in things outside marriage that she shouldn't have been. And so I knew that there were things that just weren't going to go over in the Christian book publishing world. And so, but I was also worried that it was too Christian for the secular world. So I was really, really pleased with Alcove Press and how they really seemed to be open to that space that I wasn't sure existed.
How about you, Erin? How did working at the publisher come first? Did publishing your books through them come first?
I've worked for this publisher since I was 22, so it'll be 20 years in March. And I have never aspired to write Christian fiction at all. I was an English major, and that's the type of writing that I'm interested in. I love reading literary fiction. I wanted to write fiction that to me was meaningful and had a lot to do with grappling with real life things. And I wanted to do it in a lyrical way, but I also wanted it to sell, I wanted everything. And like Kathleen, I don't think I knew exactly what I was writing at first. I was just writing. And my first book had historical elements, it had women's fiction elements, it had faith elements, and it really seemed like it could fit everywhere or nowhere. And we did take it out to a number of different traditional publishers, and it got a little ways in a couple of them with the editorial board and whatever. For whatever reason, it didn't land. And I had wanted my then boss to read it because he'd been in the business for so long, and I really valued his opinion, and I wanted some people who were not women to read it. And he reads everything. So I said, would you just read this for me? And he said, sure. And so he read it, and he was our VP of sales. I wanted somebody to read it and tell me, like, do you think this will sell? And he read it in 2 days, which is phenomenal because it was extremely long. And he loved it. And he said, I would put a number on this right now. I would put a projection on this. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm not interested in publishing with the people that I work with. I feel like that would be awkward because what if it doesn't do well and people are kind of walking down the halls and they look at you like, oh, well, I liked it. Like I didn't want to deal with that. And he said, well, I'd like you to think of us as a backup plan. And so that's kind of what I did. And when a couple things didn't pan out, I said, all right, well, let's just send it to them. I'm sure they're going to say they can't do it because of the adultery thing. And there's also, because it deals with race, there's a couple bad words in there that had to be in there because of plot related things. They weren't extraneous or superfluous. And they said yes. And I said, well, are you sure? Because I can't sign this contract if you're going to say later, like, no, you have to take this part of the plot out because it's a huge part of the plot. And like Kathleen, this is just something that happens. People do things that they regret later, and that's part of life. And if we as Christians can't deal with that and talk about, well, what happens after? Is there hope for you? Yes, there is. Then that's a problem if we just pretend that doesn't exist. So that's how I ended up with a Christian publisher. And I've done 3 books so far. I have 3 more to go that are all contracted. And so, we'll see what happens afterward. But they were happy to try. They've been trying to expand their offerings, where it's not just the typical historical romance, romantic suspense, all in a Christian vein. They wanted to do some things that were more general. And so myself and a couple other writers come to mind, Susie Finkbeiner, who I think is here tonight, and Sean Smucker we're all kind of in that vein of a little bit more literary, not necessarily the typical Christian fiction. And I think they're experimenting with us.
Oh, that's fantastic. I, like Kathleen, wrote several books before I got to the book that ended up being my debut novel. And I was lucky enough to land also at the same press that Kathleen landed at, with an enthusiastic editor. It's a hard sell sometimes to have a main character who is so grumpy. So it was nice to have an editor who didn't want to dull her or make her more pleasant. We're all Midwest women, so we know how incipient the idea of Midwest niceness can be. I wanted to write her not Midwest nice, so it was a real pleasure to do that. So that was a pretty nice path to publication for finding not only an agent that liked that voice, but also a house that was acceptable for that. But again, it's not religious. Somebody had a great question earlier. Do you plan to have the same amount of faith concepts in your future books, more, fewer? For me, eventually I would like to write characters of faith. I think that's one thing I will continue to develop in my women's fiction, especially, and see how that gets, some of my characters that I've had in the past in books, continue to work on them. I think it's a journey as a writer and as a person of faith. So how about you, Erin?
I don't have plans of anything. I just am writing the next thing that I want to write. And the book that I've been talking about tonight, All That We Carried, I can't see writing something that is a lot more religious than that, unless I were to write something where a character was clergy or, something like that, where I think it would probably get more religious. But a lot of my main characters are typically not Christians. And maybe there's a secondary character in their life who is. And I think that's what throws some people when they're expecting Christian fiction. They expect the main character to be a Christian. And so a lot of people, when they review my books, are like, I don't feel like there was enough God in this. And why didn't you do this? And why didn't anybody get saved? But then you have people who are not Christians reading it, who are like, oh my gosh, there's just so much God in this, you know? So you can't please everyone. You can't please anyone. And so you may as well please yourself. And I just write the next thing that I want to write. And it's the next thing that's on my mind. It's, you know, the theme of whatever I've been thinking of. So if I'm been thinking about the fact that, you know, people have a particular issue where like, okay, if you're thinking about social media or even just this past year and a half of being at home, people want to be seen. So if I'm going to write about want to be seen, it doesn't have to be religious. That's not a religious topic. It's a human topic. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be noticed. Everyone wants to be valued. So that story might not have any faith elements at all.
And how about you, Kathleen? I know that you've been working on several things. So how have any of those themes tied into your work?
My sort of the thing that, so not only do we use natural family planning, but I taught natural family planning for 16 years. And so in the process of, and I wrote for the Natural Family Planning magazine. So I've had a lot of occasion to think about the real nuts and bolts of how we love each other. And because of that idea of all of the ways that we get love wrong is really sort of my area. And so this book that I've been in, it was about her, how she misunderstood what love was and thought she didn't love her husband well enough. So that, like, how we get love wrong and how that's sort of where I go with my, and how do we redeem that? For me, there's always a redemptive arc. It's always, I have this problem and I have a redemptive arc to it. So that's my faith coming out, but it won't, I find it unlikely that I could do another book that would be as, that could have as much faith elements in it as the first one did, because this character, it worked because she was in an existential crisis, thinking about life and death, and she worked at a church. So short of those two things happening again, I'm not sure that I will be able to make it work. So I'm just going to follow where it leads me. The character I'm working on right now is struggling with motherhood and coming out of an abusive relationship and learning to trust herself and realizing that she doesn't want her, like, she doesn't want her faith and what she teaches her child to just be limited to what she does on Sundays. She wants to take it out in the world and have it in the body for her daughter. And so there's that little bit, but that's it's just a very light thing that will happen at one point, and I hope it gets to stay in. But other than that, I mean, honestly, the book I'm writing right now is at a winery. That's one of those odd things that I don't understand why alcohol sort of is a no-no, because I mean, it's in the Bible. So
there you go. Well, and we can also, let's transition into more conversations about Christian fiction specifically, because there was a great question from Facebook. It said, what do you think Christian publishers need to do to attract crossover readers? So that really deals with, like, what are our expectations when we pick up a piece of fiction, or when we see that fiction is labeled as Christian fiction? What are the differences there?
Let me speak to that. Having worked at a publisher for so long, I'll say one of the challenges that I don't think most writers or readers know about is that when you are publishing with a Christian press and you are having a book sold into stores, so a salesperson is actually selling it to book buyers at stores so that they will stock it. When you're selling a book, you have to put BISACs on it, which are numbers that categorize it. And that tells the store where to put it. And if you are publishing with a Christian press, basically you have to put a religion BISAC on it, even if there's no religious content, because people at bookstores, I think, get flack when readers buy a book that they don't expect to have Christian elements and it does. they get angry about being preached at sometimes. So there's a challenge immediately where my books are, they're not Christian fiction, but they are put in the Christian fiction or inspirational sections of stores when they should be in general fiction. And that's nothing, there's nothing I can do about that. And there's really nothing that the publisher can do about that. And so one of the ways that's you try to get over that is, as a writer, if you're worried about that, being involved in groups that are not faith-based. So all of us here are in the Women's Fiction Writers Association, but it's not a faith-related group. There's people of lots of different faiths and no faiths. And that's a way to connect with other writers and to connect with people who can help you reach out to people beyond that sort of Christian fiction bubble. In addition, I think that one of the ways that people get around that is, you know, when your book is listed on Amazon, you can put it in any number of categories they put it in. And I know that we're being hosted by a local bookstore today, so I said the A word, but that is a way that people try to get past that. Now, one of the nice things about Baker Bookhouse, who's hosting us tonight, is that they actually stock books that are not just Christian publishers, which I really appreciate that about the store. There's no reason not to stock, you know, a parenting or a book about finance or whatever. That's, you know, it doesn't have to come from a Christian publisher. It could just be a good, clean book, and that's fine. And the same thing with fiction. So if it's something that is not going to have a bunch of objectionable stuff where their consumer base is going to be offended by that, then yeah, they'll stock it. But a lot of stores don't do that. They'll just go right down the line. This is a Christian bookstore, or this is a non-Christian bookstore. And if anything remotely Christian is in this book, it's going in the inspirational category. But they don't do that with other religions. You can have other faith elements of other religions in plenty of books that end up on the general fiction table.
Well, I mean, I read Christian fiction for a while and then got out of it when I started really focusing in, when I realized what I was writing was women's fiction. And since then, I've realized that some of the, like in the Catholic realm, two of the most renowned Catholic writers were Greene and Flannery O'Connor. And neither one of them wrote anything remotely resembling Christian fiction. In fact, some of their stuff, I mean, Greene, the one that I read, the priest fathered a child, and he was feeling, you know, like his whole journey was this great guilt about how he had betrayed his calling. And some of Flannery O'Connor's short stories, I mean, there are some really horrible people in those stories. So it's interesting to me. I think that what we need more of is the crossover, in which we have the Christian worldview represented in a way that does not feel like it has to be, you know, put in the inspirational section. And the more that we can do that crossover, the more I think that's why it's like soft evangelization, that we have the potential to make it to bridge. And the bigger that bridge is, then maybe some of these ghetto things, the ghettoing might go away. But I think it'll be a long process. That's my hope anyway.
I think that's a really great insight. And since we are coming to the time, we probably have about 10 minutes left. So if you have any final questions, make sure you pop them in the chat. We did have some questions about books, book recommendations, things that we've been reading and enjoy that might be considered crossover fiction or address religion in interesting ways. And I can start because I've been thinking about this. I'm going to be writing about this for Elle Magazine, should be out pretty soon. Two of the books that I've been thinking about recently, one of them I'm not recommending in that article, but it's called Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi. And it is a very interesting faith journey. And it definitely doesn't end with a solid answer on where the main character ends up at the end of the book. But there's lots of science and religion mixed there, as well as sort of complex family relationships of a young female Black scientist. And it's really fantastic. And the other one I would recommend is if you read in the YA space, a book that just came out a few weeks ago was Never Saw Me Coming by Erin Hahn, that talks about a sort of purity culture within Christian communities. And it deals with two teenagers of faith who fall in love. And what I like about the book is that they're pushing back against some of the institutions that they find challenging, or some of the youth group issues that they see in their church, but they don't end up losing their faith, which it's so rare to read a book in the YA space where it's not anti-faith, where at the end of the book, they don't reject religion. So I really, really enjoyed that book. So Never Saw Me Coming by Erin Hahn. And yes, somebody said in the chat that they love Transcending Kingdom. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful audiobook as well. How about you, Erin? Do you have a good recommendation for us?
I am the slowest reader. Seriously, last year I finally got to a book that my college roommate recommended to me in like 2001 or 2. I mean, it's terrible. I read so much for work that I don't do as much personal reading, and I read so slow. I think because I read at night a lot and I fall asleep. So I don't know that I have a recommendation of a particular crossover book, but I did also recently read Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, and I really enjoyed that. And that's just such a fine example of writing about faith and writing a character who is a man of faith, but who has gone through a lot of negative experiences, a lot of doubt, a lot of dealing with the results of people being human and not being perfect. And I really enjoyed that book quite a bit. And I think it's a classic. And certainly that one was definitely not stuck in the Christian ghetto. So I don't know how she manages that, but good on her.
And how about you, Kathleen? What's something you've enjoyed recently or not so recently?
As I was thinking about this question, I found that it's the books that I would recommend really don't have a faith base at all. Particularly, they're things that speak to my faith. So for instance, The Hate You Give is one that I read in the last year. And that was a book that really convicted me on a faith level, because it was one of those things that made me realize how much in a bubble I am, and to see injustice, and to see the powerlessness and why some of the things are the way they are. And that convicted me on the level of faith, reading that book. And another one, there's a book called True Places by another WFWA author friend named Sonia Jurg, and True Places is about a woman who she's really, really well off, and she has a really entitled husband and 2 really entitled kids that just make you want to shake them. And she is finding herself dissatisfied, and then encounters this teenager who's been living in the woods for who knows how long. And the clash of those 2 cultures just really brings into focus materialism and the sort of self-satisfied way in which we look at the world. And so both of those books for me really challenged me on a faith level, even though they don't really have much, if anything, to do with faith. So I guess that's kind of where I come from on this.
So I think that kind of leads into maybe what might be a good final question. So what are we missing if we limit our reading list to just clean books? So, the books that we talked about, they would be books that you might find in the literary fiction sphere or in the women's fiction sphere, but that may not be completely clean content. So, what do you think that adds to our experience as readers and also as writers?
I think that when you limit yourself to any sort of art content that is non-threatening in any way, it doesn't threaten your sensibilities. It says everything that you want it to say. It makes you feel good about yourself in all ways, because it doesn't challenge your deep-seated worldview things that you've believed because you were raised in a certain place or you were taught them as a kid, it doesn't challenge you at all. I think that you're missing most of the point of art. I don't think that it's there to just make us feel good. I think that certainly that's part of it. But if you never acknowledge the darkness in this world and you pretend everything's fine, not only is that just not realistic and you're living in a bubble, but I think it is detrimental to your own spiritual health, because you can pretend that, okay, I'm fine, I've got it all together, I'm a nice person, I'm doing the right things. And that is not what Christian faith is about. Christian faith is about all the things that you've done wrong and all the things you will do wrong and why you can't make up for those things. And you need Christ in order to do that. And to surrender your own darkness is important. To think that you don't need to be forgiven anything is really detrimental to having a faith life that's vital. And I think that when we pretend the world is fine, then we are fooling ourselves about our own hearts.
Kathleen, what do you want to add to that? I saw you doing the raise the roof symbol down there.
Preach, yes. But I will say on the other side of this, I think that also if we only go if we try to, I think that the Christian worldview, whether it's in Christian fiction or in crossover fiction, is very important, because there is a very jaded worldview that comes that would seem to indicate that there is no hope. And that also is not Christianity. And the fact that, like, I think Christianity has gotten a lot of black eyes in recent decades. And we have to, I think that what crossover fiction can let us do is make it clear that Christians are not either perfect or monsters in disguise who are pretending to be perfect while being hypocrites. I think that to have authentic Christian characters who are messing up and trying to do things right is a really, really important thing to see. And if we don't allow for that, if we only go for the purely secular that has no religious content to it at all, then we run the risk of skewing our worldview in an equally, the opposite and equally problematic direction.
I agree with that.
I think the greatest thing that fiction can give us is the chance to build empathy and to live a million lives in the life that we only get one. It's been proven that people who read more have more empathy with people. And honestly, if that's the only lesson that people take away from fiction, I truly believe that makes the world a better place, just to have a little bit of empathy and grace with other people, whether it's connected to a faith-based worldview or not. And so I am a book, I've shoved books at people any chance I get, and hopefully they'll take something away from it that helps lead them to a better life, whatever that looks like for them. Okay, well, I think that might be all the time we have. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Yes, and I wish that, I don't know if the chat's going to be available to us to look at later, because I wasn't following it the whole time, so I hope it doesn't disappear. But we can talk with our hosts about that afterward. So I did want to say, first of all, thank you to everybody who came to this panel. I want to thank Kathleen for coming up with the idea and for connecting with Rachel and I. And I really want to thank Rachel for her expert interviewing ability. She has a podcast, folks. I don't know what the name of it is, but she should say it before we leave. Go ahead, Rachel.
It's called Blind Date with a Book. We set people up with books based on dating app questions.
Oh, I love that. Blind Date with a Book. So write that down, put it on your Castbox or whatever you use, Stitcher for your podcasts. And we'll have, when we leave, there's going to be a few little panels that remind you of our books. And so if you missed the titles and everything, we also want you to find us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. I got off Twitter because I just realized I just don't like it at all. But we were happy to connect with you. And I'm really glad that you took the time to join in with us tonight. Do you ladies have any other final words before we say goodbye?
No, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy weeks to join us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yes, yes, and I just want to say, I also am looking forward to reading the chat because I could see the previews of all, but I was trying to pay attention to this discussion. So I'm very much looking forward to it, and I appreciate such an active chat. You know, when we're on, it's like we're just talking to each other. So to know that you're all out there.
Oh, here we go. You can save the chat by hitting the 3 dots in the chat right now. Okay, don't turn this off. We got to hit our 3 dots. Okay, save chat. Nice. You're so smart, Rachel. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you later.